In late 2007, I had the opportunity to conduct a long personal interview with author Vince Flynn, who died this past week. It was published in the March 2008 issue of the New Individualist magazine. I tried for some time to get a handle on who this man was. I had loved his books. I loved his writing. I had been a thriller addict myself for many, many years. But I wanted to see what made this man tick. And he gave it to me in words that were so simple. I wanted to show you a few of the photographs from the magazine article. These photographs are taken by Brian Killigrew, a New York photographer. Here's one. We had him posed in between some pillars. It almost looks like Washington, D.C., the kind of environment that he thrived in and wrote about. But we used that as there was a pool quote that I wanted to show you. And that was Vince Flynn. "I am an individualist," he said. And individualism is a core concept of what it means to be an American. And as I think of Vince Flynn, the word American and the word individualist come to mind as perfectly encompassing who this man was and what he was all about. If you think of the best things that you can about America, of the celebration of individualism, of independence, if you think of of the American spirit, the can-do spirit, the optimism, if you think of the American idea that an individual is just as important as anyone else and should not be pushed around, you think of the love of liberty, all of the kinds of things that you think of when you think of America and what makes Americans unique in the world. This guy embodied those things. I got to know Vince first through his books and then through the interview that we conducted with him. And I never spent more than probably combined maybe 10, 12 hours with Vince. But to know him a little bit was, he was so open, so generous with his time that you felt like you knew him for a lifetime. Gregarious, he was a people person, he was intelligent, witty, charming, funny, just a joy and a pleasure to be around. But he was also encouraging. He was an inspiration to the people around him. He had iron convictions, and his principles and his convictions would oftentimes get him into trouble, but he stuck by his guns no matter what. Some of the treasured things that I have from him, some of the inscriptions, like the inscription that he gave for this magazine interview that we conducted, his self-effacing humor. Great article he wrote. Sorry the subject wasn't better. And of course the subject was Vince Flynn. His encouragement, his personal encouragement. I told him that I had aspirations to be a writer myself. And we talked a bit about that, and he tried to be encouraging to me. So on several of the occasions that we had where I visited with him during his book signings in the area of Washington, D.C., I wasn't a celebrity stalker exactly, but we spent some time together at those events, and also afterwards at some dinners. And this was before I got to know him through the interview. But I told him that I had my doubts about my ability to be a writer of fiction. I had been writing nonfiction all my life. Vince was very supportive, very encouraging, and he left little messages in in the books, as you can see. To Robert, finish your novel, Vince Flynn. He did that on several occasions. He also did it in Pursuit of Honor. This was a couple of years later. Vince would be on my case to do what he thought that I should be doing with my time. And that kick in the pants was one of the things that really enabled me to have the motivation and inspiration to move forward. But there's something else that I wanted to talk about in that regard. And from a personal standpoint as a writer, and what this guy did for me. And it wasn't for anything that he said, but it was his example. During the interview that we conducted in Washington, or rather in New York City, I got a chance to ask him about how he became a writer. And he told the now familiar tale of how he had been working as a bartender at night. Of course, he had suffered all his life with dyslexia. And so to overcome that kind of an impediment, to become a #1 New York Times best-selling author, you know what kind of a heroic achievement that had to be. Well, the funny thing about that story, and one of the things that came out in the interview that I hadn't read elsewhere, Vince had written the book Term Limits, and it was one of those books that you would think, reading it today, it is so prescient, you would think that any of the various publishers would have scooped this book up, and yet they didn't. It was rejected once, twice, 5 times, 10 times, 25 times, 30 times, 40 times, 50 times, 60 times. Now, you know how difficult rejection is in most circumstances. For writers, rejection can be a deep, wounding scar. But Vince had the hide of a rhinoceros and the determination and will that I think embodies the American spirit. And so what he told me was, in the interview, was that every time he would get one of those rejection slips, and this is over a period of 5 years, he would get these rejection slips, and he would take each one of those, and he had a cork board above his computer desk, and he would put a pin through the rejection slip and stick it up there on the board. And Vince would say, "I'll show you." Now you can imagine, you've seen this guy, and many of you have seen him in person. You can imagine this stubborn Irish kid, just year after year, rejection after rejection, taking strength from the rejection itself and continuing forward and using those rejection slips as motivation. And he said the greatest experience of his life was later on, when he had been a successful author and picked up by Simon & Schuster, and he's walking down the halls, the glowing halls of Simon & Schuster in New York City, and he says that he ran into some of the editors that had rejected him back in the day. And he would just smile and go past them and say, "Hi, how you doing?" And that was his way of just sort of sticking it in their ear. Vince was that kind of a guy. He represented that can-do American spirit, that sense of independence and individualism. He knew his worth even when the people around him did not. And those were examples and lessons that I think have stayed with me and have certainly stayed with and inspired other people. Other writers, people in all walks of life. He was a man of fundamental decency. He was a great writer. He was an American individualist. And if, at the end of my life, I'm half the writer and 10% the man that Vince Flynn was, I'll die happy. Thank you very much.